Great day, Gadfly subscribers. It's Carlos, aka CJ. Hopefully, everyone's having a great day so far. It is Sunday, April the 11th, and I want to thank you for tuning in. Very excited today to be joined by London Paul of the SeriousReport.com and also Ken Shurkin Jr. of Shotgun Economics. Ken, Paul, thank you for doing this on a Sunday live stream. I hope you both are having a great weekend so far.
Morning.
Yes, morning. Yeah, well, no, it's sometimes doing things at a weekend is a good idea because we can actually focus on something specific rather than sometimes when Ken and I do things during the week, you have to be reactive to something happening almost when you're doing things. So sometimes it's good because we can reflect on, I think, broader points. There's a lot going on a day-to-day basis, but there's sort of broader implications of what's going to happen in the future. And also what's happening now, how that feeds into the context that the world is changing enormously. And we have to make I want to make one point when people go, well, we want to go back to the old way things used to be before this pandemic, whatever people believe that to be. Well, that's not going to happen. The world is changing enormously, and there is going to be huge flux, huge change. And all this World Economic Forum and all that stuff isn't because they have a plan. It's because they know the world is changing and they want to try and retain some level of relevance in the future. And the reality is they're not going to have that relevance in the future because there is this fundamental paradigm shift. And the pandemic set a whole bunch of processes in train and we can't go back. And why would we want to go back to the way it was? Because it all failed. Every aspect of our lives, whether it's economic, financial, political, societally, it's all failed. We can see all around us every day in our own nations, our own neighborhoods, our own state municipalities, or whatever it might be, counties in the UK or local areas. It's all failed. It's never going back. We don't want it to go back. The important thing is how do we as people help to shape the future? And people think we can't do that, but the reality is we're perfectly capable. We can grasp the opportunity, and collectively, this is a once in a 1,000-year opportunity for people to go, if we do things right, we can start to shape a better future. And that is exactly where we're at in history.
Yeah. Ken, your opening comment, please.
Yeah, one of the big things that Paul and I talked about, trends we saw last week, is that more and more and more local and states, municipalities and such are rejecting and rebelling against the federal government. With Biden trying to rule by fiat, i.e. just executive orders, pretty much we're starting to see more and more Arizona, Texas, Alaska. Those are just the start. Iowa has spoken out on it. There are certain things, thresholds, that are not going to be allowed by some of these more conservative states, and where the people, the politicians have the support of the people more in lockstep. You take a look at where the crime is. The crime is pretty much relegated to small areas where they have been doing a lot of the lockdowns. Same thing with the suicide. Same thing with the breakdown of society. Most of the, if you want to call it cancel culture and such, is happening in certain areas who really are bought and paid for and controlled by the system, the Cuomos, the Gavin Newsoms, etc. But you're starting to see in so many different areas around the U.S. where they're rejecting. And I think this is just going to be the start. As Paul said, you have 100 to 300 million Americans who, if they stood up, and my response is, this is exactly what the founders intended. People were supposed to stand up against their local, their state, their federal government every single day of the year. That's how you kept them in check. But as time goes on, people start getting involved in their own daily things, and they really allow and trust politicians to be able to represent them the way they're expected to represent And over time, people have a tendency to be apathetic, lazy, and such. Well, now it's coming back to roost, and you're going to see people not necessarily reaching a point, as Gerald Celente says, where they've got nothing left to lose, but their way of life has been harmed to such an extent that they're now people are now getting to that point where they're willing to make a stand. And I think you're going to see that in across the West. I mean, we already see many of these protests, many of these rebellions going on in Europe. And I think it's going to be something where perhaps this is why Washington is so focused now on trying to stir up conflicts, because they have no answer at all for what's going on in the domestic realm.
Yeah, great points, both of you, in regards to just a monumental shift. Paul, you mentioned that, because I was focused, in regards to what's happening in the States, but you make a very valid point that this is much more than that. This is a complete shift in all of Western society in terms of government and everything. You care to delve into that a little bit more?
Yeah, I mean, look, here's the fundamental problem, and I can highlight this as an example in the UK. A lot of people have invested enormous amounts of time in believing in a political system where they will vote for either party, and we have an election every 5 years, and they thought, well, if I get fed up with this political party, I'll vote the other one in because they'll do things differently and better. And the one thing the last 12 months is highlighted to people is, in increasing numbers, it's an illusion. They're starting to realize we don't have an opposition. The opposition isn't challenging the government on any aspect to do with the pandemic. And people will go, well, okay, we're not going to get into the realms of what the pandemic is. That's not the point. But that's been a focal point that's woken a lot of people up to the reality that it is an illusion. And they don't know what the answer is, but they're tired of the political system. They want change. Now, okay, that's a whole bunch of new problems as to ultimately what replaces the political system as it exists now. And at some point that will have to change fundamentally, whether it's the UK or the US or anywhere in Europe. But that's been an enormous positive aspect. And that's the thing. Ultimately, as an empire collapses and the Western Empire collapses, unfortunately, we're geared in Western nations not to be very reactive to the reality of situations. We've been conditioned to believe we live in democracy because we get to vote every 4 or 5 years. Well, we don't actually reflect upon the fact that what is real democracy, what democracy should be the fact that people's lives improve and not, the standard of living deteriorates. You've got more and more homeless people. The US is a very, sadly, a good example of that, or obviously a bad example of that. And people's standard of living is decreasing, people's job opportunities. The idea that they can, elevate themselves through some meritocratic society and become better people in terms of their ability to have a better quality of life for them and their families is just an illusion. And unfortunately, in Western nations, it takes the collapse of everything. And I've said this for too many years. It was always going to come to the point that people in the West would have to lose everything or something approaching losing everything before they'd actually accept the reality that the world they live in is largely illusionary, whether it's political, economic, financial. And we're now at that point. So in that sense, there's some positive development that people are starting to see. The problem is, as some people are seeing it, they're going, well, what's the alternative? And they've brought into the idea that there's this overarching power and mechanism that controls everything, which it doesn't. And increasingly, you're going to see why that's not the case, because as everything unfolds and collapses, they will have no answers. And as that happens, that wakes people more and more up to reality. And once people are staring at their ton of manure, as I say crudely, on everyone's doorstep, then people will react. Now, the problem is, how do they react to this? And that's something at this point we can't quantify, and whether you're in the US or the UK. But there are some positive changes starting to come out. People are thinking differently. But the other problem is there's people being driven into camps, and the virus is a great example. Those people who believe implicitly that everything the government's doing is correct and that they're doing it for our best interest. And then you've got the people on the opposite side who see everything as a conspiracy theory, everything as a nefarious plan, everything's being calculated, mapped out. And of course, neither of those things are remotely a reality. The balance lies in the middle. And I said this with Ken the other day. People should never underestimate the level of political capital that is people invest, that means they will be dogmatic. Even if they know full well that the political system is falling apart, the economic system, the financial system, even if they know that policy decisions to do with the pandemic are completely wrong, they will never change direction because they are sort of wedded totally to this system. And if they were to step out and hold their hand and say, we did this all wrong, this was incorrect, they would then commit political suicide. And once they're not in the system anymore and the system chucks them under the bus, their lives are over. What are they going to do as an alternative? They have no alternative. So they're so wedded to the system, even though they know it's failing for a whole bunch of reasons, they're never going to admit that. And that's something that's fundamentally important in terms of our understanding that we are in this chaotic phase, and it's going to get more chaotic. It's going to get more and more people are going to get more disenfranchised, more frightened. And the overarching thing is people are going to be gripped by fear. And as was said to me a decade ago, when this day comes, and it's going to come at some point in the future, do not get sucked into that realm. Sit in the eye of the storm, observe what's going on, live your life the best you can, make all the preparations you can, do whatever you can to make your life easier in relative terms through this huge transition. But once you get sucked into the fear game, whatever side of the fence you're on, it's very hard to get out of it. And unfortunately, people are kind of veering towards those kind of extremes, which is understandable, but it's not the place to position yourself. Because ultimately, once you get consumed, then you're not going to actually realize that it is over. This empire that once ruled, notionally speaking, the world, but obviously never actually did in reality, is collapsing. The world's changing, the world's moving on. It's just we in the West are the last part of that empire that people think's still a reality. Go to Southeast Asia and people go, we know it's not reality anymore. We know the world's changing. We just need to accept that, understand it, and say, okay, what can we do productively? What can we do collectively to change those things and make it start to get the process moving in the right direction? Because the present system has no answers. It doesn't have plan B, the Great Reset and all that nonsense, as though people think they've already mapped all this out, as though they could actually map out how 67 million people in Britain are going to react to the collapse. They know exactly how everyone's going to react. Of course they don't. Or 300 million Americans? No way. They have no answer. They have no solution. Their only solution is to keep getting everyone to believe in a system that's failed and involves just QE to infinity, zero interest rate policy, and now we just have to give everybody everything to stop the system collapsing, even though they're accelerating the collapse.
Ken, your thoughts, Ken?
Yeah, it's kind of interesting when you take a look at where the future is headed. Here in the West, it's trying to hold on to a system that no longer really exists. While I did a little bit of a research and study, because one of the favorite individuals that loves to get vilified by the media, by the governments here in the West, and that, of course, is Russia and Vladimir Putin. And very few people could actually quantify exactly what Putin's ultimate goal when he rebuilt Russia after the fall of the Soviet Union. And really, I discovered it came down to a small or it came down to this scenario: keep old traditions, but continuously move towards the future. It's understanding that it's our past, it's who we are as a people, it's who we are or what we are as a country that makes us strong, but we cannot live in that past. There was a similar situation in history where Peter the Great took a journey to most of Western Europe during the Middle Ages, or the Renaissance area, and he saw what the future was. And he came back and he saw people still, most of the people still living were wearing caftans and living in the Dark Ages. And he ripped them out and modernized them, but he did not give up what the Russian soul and that was about. This is really what Putin in Russia is all about, is holding on to the things that made them strong. It's the same thing with China. China's strength has always been its imperialism and its people. It has enough people to pretty much drive any type of policy or modernization or future going forward. But here in the West, we live under the axiom of that one saying that goes, the learners will inherit the earth, but the learned will find themselves completely completely equipped to deal with a world that no longer exists. Think about what the moment Biden has come in, it's go after Russia, go after China. It's trying to steal the rights and liberties of the people, and it's trying to push this garbage global warming and this globalism that was pretty much leading up to during the Obama years, going back and trying to do things that failed. And with that mindset and that mentality, China and Russia really do not have to do anything against Europe, the United States, etc. All they have to do is continue moving forward in their own goals and plans and watch the West collapse under its own weight of futility. Taking a look at, I was looking this morning on Twitter, Danielle DiMartino Booth was referring to something Jamie Dimon said we got smooth sailing till 2023, and then yada 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 yada. I'm sitting going, wait, what? I'm reminded of what Reinhardt and Rogoff came up with in regards to debt to GDP. We had the first decline in GDP in over a decade occur last year thanks to lockdowns. And yet they have printed tens of trillions of dollars, if not more, to try to keep things sustained. Well, once you get to 90% debt to GDP, any public money that is printed does not bring, or hardly, it's a diminishing return. So once you get to 90%, you might have, say, 95 cents of every dollar makes $1 of growth. We are currently at 134% debt to GDP in the United States alone, which means that taking that ratio, for every dollar they print, we get about 5 cents of economic growth. And because they have to roll over the debt and keep the interest rates down, they cannot stop printing. So at what point do we get negative growth from all this money printing? The West is destroyed. There's no waiting till 2023, 2025, whatever. It's done. It's over. And the only thing you might see in local areas are those who disconnect themselves from Washington, D.C. policies and start trying to build themselves homogenously within their own state borders. But I think that's going to be few and far between. The majority of people live densely in most of the major cities. One of the things that's got to change is that they've got to break up this dense population. This is where many of the problems occur, because mankind was not supposed to have 11 million people on an island the size of what, Puerto Rico, you know, that type of thing. So we're starting to see the ramifications, and we've been seeing this crack since 2008, probably even going back to 1999. But they've been able to sustain it because America as a whole is just too big and too strong to simply just collapse. But we are getting ever closer to that point that, you know, the political, the educational, the financial, the legal, every single point or part of American society is corrupt.
Yeah.
And if it's corrupt like that, then it can't sustain.
Yeah, great points to the both of you. And one of the things that I want to truly advocate for and really try to push forward is this understanding. And Paul, you've spoke to this many times, is that we as a people have to come together. That this is going to require a unified effort, you know, regardless of those things. And you know, I didn't share this with you guys, but I think it's, in terms of the conversation, I think it has a lot of value to add. And I couldn't think of a larger format for someone to just really speak a lot of truth. And this happened during the NCAA tournament that, you know, had a massive audience. I'm not sure if you guys had the opportunity to listen to what Charles Barkley had to say in regards to the political, the divide and conquer mentality. So I want to play this because I think there's a lot of value to what he says in this little quick segment.
Shared that news, how painful it was.
Yeah, but the one thing I took out of that piece was, man, I think most white people and black people are great people. I really believe that in my heart. But I think our system is set up where our politicians, whether they're Republicans or Democrats, are designed to make us not like each other so they can keep their grasp of money and power. They divide and conquer. I truly believe in my heart most white people and black people are awesome people. But we're so stupid following our politicians, whether they're Republicans or Democrats. And their only job is, hey, let's make these people not like each other. We don't live in their neighborhoods. We all got money. Let's make the whites and blacks not like each other. Let's make rich people and poor people not like each other. Let's scramble the middle class. I truly believe that in my heart.
So let me pause this real quick and figure out how to do it real quick because my screen is going crazy right now. So bear with me for just a second.
Man, I think most.
There we go. So, you know, obviously he's speaking to some of the racial divide, but I think it speaks volumes in terms of the divide and conquer mentality that we've witnessed the last several years. And I think more people are waking up to understand that perhaps that's part of the plan. Now, we've spoken about it for many years, but you know, now it's time to really, you know, to understand that the political solution is more than likely, it's not going to occur at the federal level. It's going to be, you know, Ken, what you alluded to, at the state and the local levels. Commentary, gentlemen.
Well, yeah, look, I think this is one aspect of, I mean, the United States has far greater problems in some senses than Europe and the UK, but the one thing that might be a big advantage going forward, even though it causes constitutional headaches, is the fact you have so many states that can potentially make a stand, do things different politically, and start to, you know, and it might just take one state to actually make a real positive stand, to stand against the federal government and implement some changes that start to see some progress. Now, this isn't going to change the economic position of the United States or the financial position, but there needs to start to be a fundamental understanding of, and Ken makes the great points about the corruption that exists throughout the entire system, whether it's political or whatever else it might be. And once state starts to make some fundamental changes that can address fundamental problems, the economic and the financial side is something that's going to have to come further down the track. We've said this before. At some point, the US is going to have to sit down with, and I don't say it's Bretton Woods because that would be a mischaracterization, but it has to be something like that, to get an agreement on how you have to structure things and change things in the future. That's going to come at some point, but it doesn't mean you have to sit there and wait for that to happen before, you know, some positive changes can be made. I think that's more problematic in the UK to do that because of how, I mean, we do have local government, but local government doesn't have the same capability to affect change. And in some senses, that's actually a positive in the UK because, frankly, local governments are largely more useless than central government in doing the things it's supposed to do. So there are some positives to take out of that, and I think it's something that, you know, and it is ultimately, it's down to the people to acknowledge the fact what is the fundamental problem we have. It's not each other. Yeah, and also, you know, particularly for the US, they need to start to understand we can have disagreements with other nations or with each other, but fundamentally we have to find the positives. We have to find ways we can work together to improve the betterment of people's lives collectively. And when you start to get the trust amongst people and they move away from this divide and conquer mentality, then they'll realize they have far more in common with each other than they actually ever realized. And it builds trust. I think fundamentally the political system has inherently built huge distrust in amongst the people with each other. And instead of huge distrust in the political system, well, again, we've come to around to that point again, that people are becoming more disillusioned. And Ken makes some real great fundamental points about the Biden administration. I mean, it's like you might as well roll back 12 years, years ago or something. I mean, you're looking at the same policy decision. Okay, China's a slightly different situation, but there was some element of anti-Chinese policy even during the Obama era. But you know, Ukraine is a great example of just rehashing an old failed, Obama administration policy decision. So, but people need to realize that's not the future. And the entire system is going to have to be restructured. And that's another reason why all these people going, we'll get the republic back in 3 months or next week, or this is a 10, 20, 30, 40-year process to make the fundamental change. It doesn't mean fundamental changes can't happen in 2 years or 3 years or in 6 months, but it's a long process. You can't root out the fundamental problems. And the UK is the same thing. It's going to take a long time to change the system, to change people's attitudes. But the fundamental point, which he makes superbly, is just come together, realize if we work together, the sum of our parts is infinitely greater than us as individuals. And we can affect change. Because the one thing I've seen in the UK as an example with regards to the pandemic is when there's even a small amount of reaction to government policy where people are not happy about it, they're immediately backtracking, they're immediately hesitant, because that shows they do have to react. Problem is they've never had to do this because people have bought into a system. Well, the only positive thing as everything collapses, people don't buy into that system. So the divide and conquer that separates us for all manner of reasons will hopefully start to disappear. And as the US collapses, or the UK, hopefully the people will recognize that we as individuals, whatever our ethnicity, whatever our political persuasion, maybe it's religious, whatever it might be, that we actually realize we're not the problem. We didn't cause this problem. Therefore, we need to start to work together. The risk, as Ken and I have discussed, is that some populist idiot actually assumes power. I mean, and I don't want to use historical context too much, but there is a risk, and we have to be extremely careful. We don't have a populist who has no real mandate other than sounding like they oppose the current system. But that's the starting point. If we want to change things, we have to change as people. We have to be peaceful. We have to cooperate. We have to work together. And if we do that, we can accelerate this process. I mean, just as a small side note, look at Russia. When Ken made the point, it's true. Putin came in 2000 and knew what needed to be done. 20 years later, they've still got fundamental challenges. Okay, they've had to deal with sanctions and all manner of things. But the one thing that's fundamentally helps Russia as a nation is that the people are pretty much united. They pretty much believe in the nation. I'm not going to use the term patriot because I don't like that term. I think it's very divisive. But they care about their nation. And if you want to extrapolate that just slightly further, the one thing Westerners do not understand is that the vast bulk of Chinese people completely believe in the Chinese system. They totally believe in Xi Jinping as their leader. He's delivering the things he's promised to deliver them. They agree with whatever things we disagree with in the West. But Ken made the great point. Underpinning all this is thousands of years of Chinese culture and a Chinese way of thinking. And that's never gone away. So they've taken the bedrock of their nation and they're building it and changing it and evolving it. And that's the principal thing with Russia as well. Does this bedrock and the foundation on which the nation was built? Truthfully, with the UK has a degree of that because it has a long history. With the US, it's a very young nation. I don't see that to the same extent. That is a fundamental problem that is going to be a challenge. Is it surmountable? Yes, because they do make the point. Fundamentally, most people are decent people, and they are. They don't want to go out their way to make other people's lives difficult, or they want to impose their will. Most people are decent people, and when all the decent people come together in unity, they will achieve things they believe to be impossible. And the truth is, things are only impossible when from our perspective, we think we can't achieve these. There's nothing actually fundamentally impossible if we come together and we can achieve those objectives. And I fundamentally think in 20, 30, 40, 50 years, we'll look back and go, the only sad thing is it took us till everything collapsed to realize just how simple and easy it is for us as a collective to achieve positive change. And people might not want to believe this. The reason China's evolved the way it has is largely because 1.4 billion people want those changes. Bless you, Ken. And they want that change. They desire that change. And the government goes, we're going to achieve these goals. And there's a driving force, and that's why they're ascending as a nation, and the Southeast Asia's ascending, is because they have that drive amongst the people and a belief in their nation. We don't have that belief, but fundamentally we don't believe in each other.
Yeah, very well said, Paul. Ken, any follow-up discussion regarding that?
Yeah, apologize for that. I was actually trying to push the button to pause it so I could cough, and I actually pushed it the wrong way.
No worries.
No worries.
One of the more important things that we've discussed this a number of times, but it really has to be emphasized at a time, not just 2008 when the world had a financial crisis, but now when we've got multiple different things coming about around the world. The West especially has some of the most incompetent leaders ever imagined. And you know what, I'm going to say something, and it's not a misogynistic thing, but if you really look at it, our entire the primary financial gurus in the United States and the West now are women. Janet Yellen, Christine Lagarde, the person who's in charge of trade, the person who's in charge of the Chamber of Commerce. They're putting up individuals in who have a long track record of incompetency simply because of the gender they are, or what sex they are, or I should say what race they are. This is pretty much the epitome all across our government. The states have a few individuals like DeSantis down in Florida, maybe Abbott in Texas, etc., who are willing to stand up against all opposition and do the right thing based on what they've determined. But for the very most part, at the federal, at the state, at the local levels, the leadership is absolutely incompetent, ignorant, and more destructive than helpful. And I mentioned an example. Paul and I the other day was Pope Innocent VII. He hated cats, so he ordered a papal bull to have as many cats destroyed across Europe as you could find. Well, within 5 or 10 years, the rat population had grown through the roof, and many of those rats had the Black Plague. So somebody's lunacy, ideology of hating cats helped spur the advent of the Black Plague across Europe, which killed 50 to 75% of the population. Well, probably about 50%. And we're seeing that today. The Governor Cuomo, let's take people who are sick with COVID and put them in nursing homes. That's just one microcosm example. But along the same lines, this whole lockdown mentality, this whole printing money and giving people stimulus just to survive, this whole keeping people from having to pay rents, all these things are going to have consequences that are a thousandfold worse than had you let people just go through the motions and deal with this pandemic, which is probably going to be really harsh for a year and a half. Then it's going to wane. Then it might come back, over the next decade, which many different types of these pandemics have a tendency to do that, run their course over a decade with differing severities. But at a time when the West is completely bankrupt, to then have incompetent leadership sort of begs the opportunity. As Paul mentioned, he's fearful of it, but it's a we have history behind it. Is that a strong man who will stand up not for the benefit of the people, but for the open opportunity of this incompetence? We could have the Mussolinis, the Hitlers, somebody come along and take over the government, because people will desperately cling to anyone who says they will make the trains run on time.
Yeah, sorry, go on, Kev.
Oh, no, I'm done.
Yeah, you make a point. I have said this before, but I want to make this point with regards to the incompetency level of things, as opposed to all these people scheming and plotting, as many people have been led to believe. And look, I go back in a professional capacity to 2006. And I used to do a lot of observation of some sort of macroeconomic factors, or when I started to observe problems. And for me, I didn't know it would happen in 2008, but you could see problems in 2006. And it got to 2007, and I can remember talking to people, and everyone went, "This will never happen. This is nonsense. This is ridiculous." Kind of almost laughing at the prospect of me saying this. And I actually wrote to the then, in the UK, to the government at the time, and said, "This is going to happen. You are almost certainly you will react in trying to save the financial system by bailing out the banks, which means the only way you're going to bail the banks out is QE. And in order to sustain QE for any length of time, you're going to move to zero interest rate policy," because that was obvious. That was exactly what was going to happen. And I said, when you do this, ultimately, you will destroy yourselves. You will destroy your financial system. You'll destroy the dollar. You'll destroy, I don't know, phrased it in a way that was saying, if you do this, you'll destroy yourself. Now, ultimately, they did precisely what you expected them to do, and it was a survival mechanism. They didn't go sit there and intelligently work out and say, well, okay, we've got a problem with the financial system of banks. Okay, we're going to have to reform the banks. We're going to probably have to go back to Glass-Steagall. We're going to have to separate investment banking. Some banks will have to disappear. Some aspects of banks will vaporize, and that's just the way it is. And if they'd actually done that, then we wouldn't be where we are today to the same extent. Yeah, ultimately the system was failing, but they wouldn't have been in this acute catastrophic mess they're in today. And that was a policy decision based on the fact they reacted to something. They didn't think of the consequences of it. They didn't assess the risks. What assumptions are we making? What are the dependencies, meaning what's the contagion effect ultimately of doing this? They didn't give a damn about that. And it wasn't because they were thinking, well, it's not, sorry, they didn't think, well, actually, ultimately, this will blow up the entire system in the sense of how you and I and everyone else functions in it. They didn't even give it a moment's consideration. So they thought, we'll do this, we'll normalize this situation, and eventually interest rates will return to normal. We won't have QE forever, and it'll all work itself out. And in 5 years, we could sit here patting each other on the back going, job well done. Again, stupidity, arrogance, ignorance, no contemplation of the reality of what was unfolding. And then, of course, things carry on and we get this. And then we sort of got to September 2019, the whole repo thing, big alarm bells going off. And March 2020, big alarm bells going off. And the alarm bells keep going off. And then we had the pandemic. And the pandemic was again, and we said this, don't want to go into too much detail, but it's the worst possible nightmare, because now the problem they thought they had contained and they could rationalize that problem and normalize it suddenly burst out into the real population, and they had no control over it. And now they just have to keep printing money, and they keep doing this because they have no choice. They know if they stopped doing it, that the entire nation, like the United States or the UK or Europe, would grind to a halt. Everything would collapse, and they know they can't allow that to happen because they know how the masses will react to that. We can't quantify specifically, but we know in a broad sense, if you destroy everything, the people aren't just going to sit there and go, well, that's fine. Particularly after telling us all these years that the economy was perfectly fine, there weren't any problems, there was nothing to worry about. Yeah, we've got this pandemic, don't worry, it's a transient problem, everything's transient, pumping fiscal money's transient, inflation transient, it's all today, it's here today, but don't worry, like Ken says, at some point it's all going to normalize, everything's going to be back to normal, don't worry about it. They know full well that's not reality. And we made the point the other day, and Varoufakis said a great point when he talked about Greece, because he went, there's a book he's got, if you like politics and you want to understand what goes on in the EU, he's got a book, Adults in the Room. I recommend buying it, get a copy of it, because it will tell you and show you the insanity of how the system works. But he makes the point in other interviews that ultimately they'll do everything to preserve the status quo. They'll do everything to say you have to have austerity, you have to have tax hikes, you have to do everything. You cripple your nation. But they know full well at some point in the future, there's going to have to be a massive haircut on Greek debt, which is exactly what they should have done 3 or 4 years ago, or 5 or 6 or 8 years ago, but they refused to do it. Why? Because we're back to that investment in political capital. That's what drives decisions. And they don't think of the consequences, but ultimately they're going to have to do the very thing they never wanted to do. And in this case, they're going to ultimately have to do the things they never wanted to do in 2008, and they should have done, and which would have preserved their empire for some period longer than is ultimately going to play out, but they refused to do it. And now they're going to pay the ultimate price for doing it. So there isn't some concerted plan. And we need to start to understand there aren't these people in there making decisions because they're, ultimately they're going to benefit from it. Even the people who everyone thinks is the fractions of 1% making all the money, they know full well the gravy train's over. They know it's all blowing up. They'll try and make capital as long as they can out of it. But ultimately, if their money's all in fiat, they're going to their wealth will disappear also, irrespective of the consequences of the fact that most of their wealth's tied up in paper. It's not realized money. They don't have hundreds of billions of dollars sitting in a bank account. That's not it. It's an understanding that this company is worth this, that, and therefore equates to their wealth. So it's, again, massively complicated problem that's oversimplified, and we need to start to appreciate the fact that why more than ever we need to understand that this system doesn't have any answers, and we need to start to say, okay, what are we going to do to address that? What can we do collectively? And there's not an easy decision to make, and it's difficult to get people to believe that this system is totally out of control and there's no resolution. But as I said, in 2007, it was obvious, but the part of them refused to accept that obvious was going to happen. Then when the obvious happened, they still refused to address it. And that's why the Draghis of this world just keep kicking the can down the road, because they think ultimately somehow it will resolve itself. Ultimately, it won't. And we're now at that point, and they don't have any answers. And unfortunately, when it all blows up, they're still not going to have any answers. So the question is, who has the answers? Who can affect change? Well, collectively, we can do that. But how do we approach that? And as Ken rightly says, we need to avoid this strongman mentality that could actually become even bigger a problem. It won't last very long, but a year or two of that kind of governance would cause a decade of damage beyond anything we can ever comprehend. So we have to try and also avoid that. So that's why there are fundamental challenges, but don't buy into this idea that they're allowing everything to collapse and somehow they've got this masterful plan at the end of it, because there is no masterful plan. When you've blown it up, it's gone. Once it's gone, there is no way back, because that's why we have the ascendant east. That's why we're having Biden reigniting tensions with Russia, why Biden's accelerating all the problems that the Trump administration brought in with regards to China. Why they challenge them? Because they know that's the future. That's the new reality, which is a completely different world that many other nations now want to grasp. And you start to see little things where, look at El Salvador. The US wanted to send some senior diplomat, and the El Salvador president went, "We're not interested. We don't want to talk to you. Go away." These are fundamental changes where they're going, you're part of the old world. We don't want anything to do with you anymore. We want to embrace a new world, a new way of doing things. And we in the West are the last people, as we said, to do this. And we need to start to realize we have to engage in that and stop making this assumption that the current system actually has a clue what they're doing, because the last decade proves they never had an answer. They never had a solution. And ultimately, if they did have this solution to collapse everything, they'd have done it in 2008. They didn't. Why? Because they know once it's gone forever.
Gentlemen, as we witness several states attempt to, fight back or really to depeg from, the federal government, are there any thoughts in terms of what you perceive the federal government may or may not do? Obviously financial, but and the reason why I state that is because I think for the most part, DeSantis in Florida has been, really one of the most outspoken persons, and all it takes is one person to step up and do this. And now obviously we have several states, doing the same. But as we witness the federal overreach that's taking place in terms of Biden utilizing executive orders, what will the federal government do in terms of the states that do this? I know that in February 1, there was actually a formal draft that was submitted in Texas. An actual secession bill was formally filed. What are your thoughts on that in terms of looking at more of a decentralization here, in the United States?
Yeah, as a matter of fact, Paul and I have talked about this a few months ago. It was kind of funny because being strong, I don't want to say patriot, but in the constitutional system, one of the points that Paul had made was the Constitution. I think it was the Constitution doesn't work in America anymore. And my first knee-jerk reaction was, how dare you say that? But when you step back and you take a look and you look at the whole fundamentals about this, the Constitution was written when we were 13 colonies next to each other in a small region, trying to bring together different peoples under a few like-minded. But over the course of the next, I would say 100, 112 years, we had new states come in, which were themselves segregated. We got into the big discussion, or there was a big discussion back then about which states are going to be slave states, which states are not going to be slave states. Then, of course, in the West, you had those that were providing a lot of the resources. And even the Federal Reserve, when the Federal Reserve was first built, there were 12 Federal Reserve chapters, just like they are today, but each one set interest rates for their own region, because the Fed that was in Kansas City or in Chicago dealt mostly with the meat packing plant. Those that were in San Francisco dealt with the mining operations. Those in Atlanta were dealing with agriculture. So each part of the country had different needs and different requirements, rather than what has ended up happening is that all monetary policy, all fiscal policy is from one centralized location that really doesn't understand the fact that the entire country is different in different regions. So does the Constitution today really fit a 50-state, several protectorates, and this worldwide presence that it does? In essence, it really doesn't, because it's in part, it's been part of the foreign policy that says we've got to democratize the world. Well, the Middle East is Muslim, and Islam is a government unto itself, just like a religion. The same way that Judaism is a religion as well as a government. So you can't treat other countries and their ideologies the same way you would treat ours, under this guise of freedom. And I think really in the long run, America is going to break back into several different regions, not because this is part of some nefarious plan that the globalists want to do, but I think that people are just going to do it. You know what? If California wants to, and New York want to burn themselves to the ground, escape from New York and escape from LA, we could care less. But those in Montana, Idaho, Eastern Washington, etc., they're going to be like-minded thing. Same thing with, say, Nevada and Arizona. Same thing with a number of places in the South. And you could see that. My only fear, of course, is when you have segregated regions like that, what are you going to do for national defense? But, somebody like Texas, a state like Texas, if necessary, could build a militia that's equivalent to the entire U.S. military we have now. So
maybe the states could just divide up the 300 plus bases that the United States has equally
something like
around the globe.
But I think what originally was set up, because each region in the United States is significantly different, and they have different needs, different requirements, and different attitudes, that trying to integrate, the liberal and conservative, look at places like Texas or Arizona or Georgia, which were staunch red states. Now they're becoming purple, and it doesn't really. The majority of people aren't protected in their way of life when you allow activists to come over for their own ideological reasons, not because they want to have a better life, but because they want to skew the political play. Well, if you have that, is it any different than the fact that the number are one of the top 5 and one of the fastest growing industries in America and Ireland, by the way, is sex work and OnlyFans?
Yeah.
We're not providing anything towards the future, towards industrial rebuilding, jobs. It's just the same old hospitality, and people then are also finding out that, there's just nothing out there for them besides waiting on the government, largesse. So instead, they're using the internet for sex work. I mean, it's the saddest thing in the world.
I do think, though, that there's a kind of interim solutions, and then there's a long-term change of objective, and in some ways you want to decentralize certain aspects, most definitely, but you may end up having to centralize something, and I'll explain, try and do it briefly, otherwise you could talk for a long time. But the US rather is fundamentally driven economically, shall we say, by monopolies, big corporations. Now, there's clearly an argument that says the big corporations need to be broken up so they become less dominant, or you may temporarily say, well, some of the big corporations, and I'm not saying across the board, but certain corporations, you may want to temporarily nationalize them. And the reason to do that was because then you can then internally start to assess, okay, what are the problems with big corporations, or, say utility companies or whatever. I don't know fundamentally how every aspect of that works in the US, and I'm not going to pretend to. But the point is, you need to start to assess where the problems are, but you most certainly have to break up big monopolies and remove their power, because they have far too much power over the federal government. They have too much power on a state level, etc. So there's one fundamental challenge. You also have to get the balance right between what the federal government can impose on states and where there's common need. And you talk about national defense. I think the US will break up into regions, but that doesn't mean you can't have a national defense policy. That's possible to do that, and in some ways it would logically make sense. But therefore, if you break things up into regions, you need to have far stronger regional government, but it has to be government that works. But you also have to have a situation where, okay, if it breaks up, then the idea of the United States or the president starts to become an entirely different, and arguably becomes irrelevant, and that in itself may have some fundamental challenges. But if you retain the president as it is now in an interim way, then the president needs to be able to affect change positively, not to interfere on a state-by-state basis to the point of absurdity. But there might be situations where a presidential decree or a presidential executive order, if it's done correctly, could be hugely beneficial collectively to nations. I mean, here's an example. If you break the US up into regions, what about tariffs on goods in the future? How does that work? Do you want to have a nationalized approach? Then there's a logic that makes sense, but you may in the future have regions that start to become economically strong in some capacity, and therefore it might be favorable to renegotiate tariffs on a regional basis, or maybe a state-by-state basis. But does that give economic advantage to certain regions or states that may be detrimental to the other parts? Because collectively, the US also has to function on some level. So it's immensely complicated. But I did make the point on it with regards to the Constitution. It doesn't work now, but it doesn't mean you destroy the Constitution. You have to refine it and make it work for not just maybe for the next 100 years or 50 years at least, that says, how is this going to work that benefits the collective, however the US ultimately ends up? But I think we can't go from where we are now to the finished article. You have to go through stages of change. And that alone means you have to change the entire political system that says you've got a 4-year presidency. I think there needs to be certain national mandates that transcend the political system that says, okay, the US needs massive infrastructure rebuilding. Okay, there's an argument, how do you finance it? The way Biden's proposing to do things is farcical and won't work. But the US needs that. How does that work? That should transcend the political system and says, this is not a matter of politics. This is a matter of improving the infrastructure of the nation, and have some plans long term as to how that benefits the American people, to target it in a coordinated way and say, we have a 10-year plan, and that plan is set in stone. No decree can change it. Okay, you might want to tinker with it slightly, but you're not going to get, Biden, for argument's sake, implementing something, and then the next president comes in and tears it up, and it gets abandoned because it's political capital. We can't be seen to tolerate, that kind of expenditure in the future. That kind of nonsensical political situation has to change, and not just in the US. It has to change in Europe, in the UK. There has to be long-term plans to drive policy decisions. That's not undemocratic. That's ultimately a way of building the backbone of a nation once again, and to give states more autonomy, so individual states can go to the Chinese or the Russians and say, we want some investment here. We'd like you to invest in our ports, or we'd like investment here. And states are able to do that on an autonomous basis because it benefits them, rather than having a centrally governed mandate that says we're sanctioning the Russians, so no one in the United States can do X, Y, and Z with them. That's ultimately a ludicrous centralized policy that, again, it's just a political mandate. It's the truth of the matter is the Beltway knows that it's lunacy doing these policy decisions, but if they've invested all this political capital, they can't turn around to the American people now and say, no, we're giving up on sanctions. No, we're just going to abandon that policy. No, we're going to remove all our military bases. Because it's political capital in their minds. So that's another part of the system that has to radically change. So just in the few minutes I've spoken about this, you can see the enormity of the challenges. And it's not a one hat fits all. There's a lot of changes that need to be made. But I do think in some capacity, nationalizing certain corporations or certain faculties of certain business sectors on a temporary basis, at least, would make a lot of sense, because it would start to remove the power base that fundamentally is one of those spheres of influence and drivers that's dictating US policy and ultimately is detrimental to the people. But if you break corporations up and redefine their capability and of what they can achieve on that basis, they can still be productive, but they're not going to be able to have that sway and influence of dictating again to sort of the federal government as to what policies are allowed to be implemented, or dictating, US foreign policy is another example. These kind of big changes that need to be made. That's why I keep saying it's not going to happen tomorrow or next week. These are long-term changes that will take years to implement. And it's going to be difficult because you're trying to persuade a whole bunch of people. As Ken said, when I first spoke to him, he was like, there's this British guy who's trashing our Constitution. That's not my point. But if you said that to most Americans, they'd react very aggressively and say, but we believe in the Constitution, and that's fine. But they need to go, well, why are we believing it? Why is it failing? And what can we do to change it so it's fit for purpose for the future? And that's another reason why empires collapse, because they sit there, rest on their laurels, believe in the past, that nothing needs to change. And if you don't evolve and change with the times and move in the appropriate ways, your empire will always collapse, because it's the one reason why it does is because it isn't constantly evolving and changing and accepting the realities of the world we live in today.
Ken, closing thoughts, please. And Paul, if it's okay, I'll take that as your closing thoughts.
Yeah, no, that's fine. Yeah.
Okay.
I think it's going to be interesting moving forward, taking a look at what happens, not just in the United States, but perhaps in Europe when they finally are able to start opening up. But I think that's almost going to be moot. If you remember back in March of last year, they decided to do the lockdowns, just the scare tactics of this pandemic, yada, yada, yada. At the exact same time, there was what appeared on the horizon as another financial collapse. Ever since then, they have done nothing but continuously print money, manipulate interest rates, and do pretty much anything they can. But we have reached the point of diminishing returns. I do not believe we're going to have any type of economic recovery going forward. We're going to actually see more and more strife, inflation that's going to hit the horizon, not just stagflation. I think we're really getting very close. That's why you're seeing digital currencies being built around the world, why there's still continuous talk about cryptocurrencies like Bitcoin. People are losing confidence, not just in the system, but the financial side as well. When that happens, what we are seeing now in the short term is it going to morph into something that really is going to separate people and society, because it's going to turn into a matter of everybody looking out for themselves. I fear that's something that could really happen over the next 6 months as we go forward, because going back to the incompetency of our leaders, we have very few people in place to be able to do the right policies that are going to not only give confidence to the people, but to actually do something that's going to matter. And this is something that I know CJ, Paul, and I are going to be talking about, relaying to you guys. And it's just, I haven't felt this, let's say, disconcerted about the West in a long, long time, at least more than a decade, going back to 2008 or before. And well, that's what we're here for.
Gentlemen, I want to thank you for a great discussion today. I also want to thank all those tuning in, participating in the live stream chat. If you have not done so yet, please go to the gadfly.vhx.tv, bookmark that site, learn about our subscription-based content, $10 a month or $100 for a year. You can also get a 30-day free trial with that subscription. And we do have some social media platforms that we post public content to. So we're also over on Twitter, which is at the Gadfly MCN. We also maintain a Facebook profile, which is at the Gadfly, and then our public YouTube channel as well. And then also don't forget to jump over and visit Paul's work over at theseriousreport.com and Ken's at shotguneconomics.com. Gentlemen, thank you for a great discussion today, and we will be back real soon.